Hello, it's Yvonne from Quilting Jet Girl. Today I'm going to be talking about burying quilting threads. This is something that happens occasionally when we're quilting. We can run out of bobbin thread, and so that means we need to know how to start and stop our quilting in the middle of the quilt. Or there are other times when our quilting plan calls for a little bit more starting and stopping across the quilt, which is the case for my quilt Cloudy Night Sky that you can see behind me. So while I was making Cloudy Night Sky, I filmed a few of my thread buries. So we're going to start by taking a look at how I normally bury my threads. And then we're going to pivot and take a look at a sample to see how I would handle burying different thread weights and other techniques than I normally use. So let's get started. So I have done some quilting on my quilt Cloudy Night Sky, and I have some thread tails that need to be buried. When I start and stop my quilting, in this case, on these quilting lines, I started here and I quilted down and stopped at the bottom, and so these are my stop points. When I start, I bring the bobbin thread up to the top of the quilt, and then I quilt, I finish my line, and when I'm finished, I bring the bobbin thread up to the top as well. And then I tie off those threads and bury them. When I am burying my threads, I like to use cinch side threading needles. I find that they are a lot quicker and easier to use. This is a brand new pack that I've ordered recently because I've almost gone through my first pack. But here is a side threading needle, so let's go through that process. We'll start at one of these end points. So when I am tying my knot, I don't tie my knot very tightly and close to the surface. I leave a little bit of play. So I'll tie a quick double knot at the end of the thread, and again, it's not super tight and taut. Then I'll grab my side threading needle and I'll just pop the thread into the side of the needle. And in this case, I'm going to be quilting another line that comes back across here. So if I crisscross this line across this seam line, I will be quilting over top of it later to help really secure it. So then I place the needle back where I finished and bring that across, and I pull the thread through to the top of the quilt. I will sometimes then flip the quilt over to make sure that it hasn't poked out on the back side of the quilt. I will often have my other hand on the back of the quilt as well to make sure that I don't feel the needle popping through. So we'll just do another real quick demonstration of that. So with my bobbin and top thread, I just tie a double knot, not very tight, so that there's a little bit of looseness. I pop the threads through the side of the side threading needle, and then I simply place the needle back where it came through on the quilt top, bring it out a little bit further away. Now the important part here is then I give the thread tail a little bit of a tug so that I get that knot underneath the surface of the quilt top. Then I'll just come back with scissors or snips and trim my thread tails, and I will have buried those threads, and I'll repeat that process across the quilt top. Another thing that's worth pointing out is that up here, where there's a very striking two-color difference, it's not as important when I am burying a white thread to take care with where I'm placing that buried thread. But if I had a blue thread tail, I would try to bury that thread tail and move it off and stay underneath the blue fabric so that I wouldn't have any shadowing of those threads underneath my off-white fabric. Now with a more zoomed in view, let's do one more so that you can see the action of me tying off and burying this thread. So let me unravel my bobbin and top thread. I will give a double knot at the top of the thread. I will grab my side threading needle, and it just pops across those threads and snaps into the eye of the needle. And then I place my needle back where I started, and notice that I'm trying to keep this thread buried underneath the seam allowance where it's double thick already, and so the thread will stay buried and hidden behind the extra thickness of the fabric. I'll pull the needle through, I'll give the thread a tug to make sure the knot gets buried, and then I'll clip my thread tail. I love using and quilting Orfil 50 weight thread, as you can see by my large collection of 50 weight thread that I've acquired over the years. However, I also do love to use their different thread weights. So I've created a sample mini quilt using different thread weights. I've used 40 weight, 28 weight, and 12 weight, and let's go take a look at some other options we have for burying thread tails. So this is the quick sample quilt that I've made. I purposely used bright thread colors against a very light quilt top. So I've used white fabric on the front and back, and I've pulled all my threads to the top of the quilt like I normally would when I am quilting. And again, just as a refresher, the gray here is Orifil 40 weight, the dark blue is actually 12 weight, and the yellow is a 28 weight thread. So let's explore some other ways that we can bury thread tails. So again, the first thing that I do when I'm going to bury a thread tail is I create a quick double knot, and I'm not making this super tight because I want that knot to be able to be popped underneath the surface, so I don't want it to be really hard up against the top of the quilt. And the first thing that I'm going to demonstrate here is using a regular needle. So instead of taking my snips and clipping the threads and then figuring out how to thread that through the needle, here's a quick tip. You can have an extra piece of thread nearby, and this tip is actually really good if this thread is really short. So say that your bobbin thread ran out and you don't have much to work with, and you don't want to unstitch a whole lot because it's the last of your bobbin. This is a really good tip for that. So take an extra length of thread and double it over and thread the tail through the eye of the needle, and then you snag the thread that you want to bury through the center of that thread, and you just pull all of that through the eye of the needle. And this is a little bit thicker, so it took it a second, and it pops that thread through the needle for you, so you're not having to clip that tail and pass it through the eye of the needle. That's just one trick, and again, that works really well if your thread tails that you need to bury are very short. And in this case, because this is a darker thread and a light background, what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert my needle right where the thread comes up at the top of the quilt, and I'm going to take my needle back towards where I've quilted as closely as I can and pull that through so that my thread tail falls really close to where the quilting is. And then I'm going to pop that knot under, and then I will just snip my thread tail. So that is another option, just using a regular needle. Let's move on to looking at another tool. We'll come back over here. This is now the 28 weight thread in the yellow. And again, I'm going to tie a quick double knot just to get that finished off on the surface of the quilt. And I'm going to rotate this sample because I'm right-handed, and this will make it easier for me because again, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try to bury this thread sort of along my quilting line. So I've got my double knot, but this is a different tool. So let me place it up against my hand. I will put a link to this in the description, but this is a needle that has a little loop on the end of it already to do exactly what I just demonstrated to you. So this is another item that you could choose to purchase, and you just pass the thread through that loop, and now you've got your needle and you are ready to insert this into your quilt top, which I'm struggling with at a distance. I usually do this up closer. There we go. And we pop that thread through. Make sure the knot gets buried underneath the surface of the quilt top, and we snip that thread tail. And then the last thing that I wanted to demonstrate is working with 12 weight thread. So when I am working with 12 weight thread, I color match using 50 weight thread in the bobbin. So I'm going to turn this sample over. So you'll see that on the back of the quilt, oh, I bonked the camera, sorry about that. So you can see that on the back of the quilt, it's a lot lighter because I used 50 weight in the bobbin and 12 weight on the top. That just is the combination that works the best for my machine. And when you're working with 12 weight thread, because it's so much thicker, you're going to want to use a bigger needle on your sewing machine. I use a 100 needle. I like a top stitch needle for me. But again, go through the same process, create a double knot. And in this case, because this thread is so much thicker, I have these tulip embroidery needles, and they have a much larger eye. So I am going to do the normal clip this thread, and then I'm going to work while I'm talking to camera, which of course means it's going to take me forever to get this thread through the eye of the needle. But then I will pass this thread through the eye of the needle, and because it's a thicker thread and this is a bigger needle, this works better. And Then I'm going to again rotate this quilt sample so that I can place my needle right by where my bobbin thread comes up on the top of the quilt sandwich, and I'm going to move my needle back along where I stitched so that the thread tail gets buried alongside my stitching line so it does not show up ghosted underneath my white quilt top. So those are just a few more options for how to deal with different thread weights and different tools that you can use and different needle types. Have fun quilting, and we'll see you next time.